Welcome one and all to the Canadian Museum of History. We're sorry to say we can't be hosting this in person thanks to COVID, but stick with us and you'll learn a little bit more about our Canadian history. We start off in the 1900s to 1910. The early 1900s were known as the Edwardian era. It started with slow modernization. First up, we've got the Wright brothers' first plane. The first successful airplane. In 1903, the Wright brothers Wilbur and Orville Wright made the first ever flight in North Carolina. On December 17th, they flew in 27-mile-per-hour winds, shocking the world. This was the Wright brothers' crowning achievement, and the people were both impressed and worried about the future in the air. The Wright brothers founded air travel and left an impact on the world for future generations. This image is an artifact of the first ever manned flight. Next up on our list is AM broadcasting, the first method of audio radio transmission. AM broadcasting is a form of radio broadcasting which utilizes amplitude modulation. This was the first ever use of audio radio transmissions, and it starred the Canadian-born inventor Reginald Fessenden. On December 23rd, 1900, Fessenden and his assistant transmitted a message over a mile apart. This was revolutionary to people across the world, and everyone was eager to see its final product, as it would be what it would take a while until the AM radio became mainstream. It would take 20 years for the radio to reach popularity, and by 1950 it had become a worldwide sensation. It was a source of information, relaxation, and entertainment. On the right, you can see Fessenden testing his t- radio system. It was still in early development, but you can tell he had something going. Next is the early rendition of the vacuum. The early version of the vacuum was also called the electronic broomstick cleaner, as that's exactly what it was. It was fitted with a filter and dust collection bag and was created by William Hoover in 1908. Both James Springer and William Hoover played a key role in its development, as James Springer is one of the ones who created its design, but Hoover is the one who bought it off of him years later and produced it for the masses. This artifact displays the Hoover, which was meant to clean your house and was incredibly hard to come by, thanks to how sought after it was and because of how expensive it was. It was pretty hard for the lower class to get it. And if you look to your right, you can see the prototype and the selling version of the Hoover. Next up, we got our next era, and that is World War I, 1914 to 1918. You may think that not much happened in only 4 years, but trust me, a whole lot did. World War I was known as the Great War and lasted 4 years, from July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918. The Macpherson gas mask. This was the first ever gas mask, and by using captured German soldiers' helmets, they added a canvas, fashioned eye holes, and a breathing apparatus that Dr. Clooney used to make a gas mask that was meant to filter out chlorine. This was the first ever gas mask meant for combat, and it was later acquired by the Academy of Medicine, and its design was improved. The Allies who originally acquired this technology were relieved that they had equipment meant to deal with the oncoming gas attacks. The artifact on display is one of the first ever gas masks ever created and is kept to study and learn from the original design. Currently, it's being held in the Museum of Healthcare Kingston, but if we were in person right now, you'd be able to see it for yourself. Next is the World War I helmet. Pretty basic, but it's important to know. This Canadian military helmet was made of solid steel and was commonly used by soldiers. It was meant to protect soldiers from fragments, shrapnel, explosions, and head trauma rather than bullets. It was created by the Canadian military and was seen as a way to protect oneself. It was a basic item and need for nearly every soldier, and it was essential. This artifact was found and used at St. Eloi in the spring of 1916, and you can see it on the right. And fun fact, that red mark on the helmet was used to distinguish Canadian soldiers from other soldiers. Next up, and last for our World War I unit, is the Ross rifle. This is a Canadian-made infantry rifle used primarily in World War One. Sir Charles Ross offered to build Canada a small arms factory, which they enthusiastically approved. This led to the Ross rifle being created, and it was Canada's main rifle, which didn't require any testing, which was the problem. This artifact was located at the Second Battle of Ypres and was found in the bottom of the ocean. It is now being held by the Memorial University at St. John's, and this gun is effective at mid to long range combat, and was especially inefficient in most forms of World War One combat, which was typically close ranged. The Canadian military saw this as a flaw as the Germans heavily outclassed them, and a gun that constantly jams and fails was not suited for close combat warfare. On the right, you can see what they found at the bottom of the ocean. It was a rack of a Ross rifle musket, and it was found in a fishing trawler. Next up is 1920s to 1939, which is also a time period for Great Expansion and the Great Depression. These two decades are vastly different. The 1920s were known for their wealth and innovation, while 1930s were known for the opposite, the Great Depression. This was a time between wars. First is the Ford Model T. This is an image of the Ford Model T, and it was released to the public in 1908 and was top of the market. This vehicle was revolutionary for its time, and it was used for universal transportation. This vehicle was sold from 1908 until 1927, meaning the same design lasted 2 decades. The Ford Model T was developed in Detroit, and this car in the image it was found in Texas. It was used as the main form of transportation and was advertised primarily in newspapers. And what you see in the right image is an uncovered Ford Model T in Texas in the United States. Next is penicillin, one of the greatest inventions. This artifact is an image of Alexander Fleming researching and developing penicillin. Penicillin is used as a general treatment for illnesses and pains, from simple injuries to elaborate ones. It was discovered in 1928 because it was widely in its development stages, but later it became widely used in 1941. Penicillin is considered one of the greatest advancements in therapeutic medicine. Doctors viewed this as a revolutionary discovery that needed to be further looked into, because at the time everyone was skeptical of new advancements. Next and last for this generation is insulin. Insulin is a hormone in your body that controls the amount of glucose in your bloodstream. That glucose converts your food into fuel. Some people are unable to produce insulin or produce very little, and that they have a condition called diabetes. Until 1921, there was no treatment, but then Frederick G. Banting discovered insulin and how to synthesize it. This was the saving grace for people around the world diagnosed with diabetes. They were forced to suffer and take dramatic measures to continue living, but thanks to insulin that Banting discovered, they were able to live. Banting discovered this by inserting a special gene into yeast or bacteria. Those genes then ended up acting like a mini biofactory, and they exerted proteins which were used for the production of insulin. On the right, you can see Frederick G. Banting working with his partner to produce the insulin. That's the end of the Great Depression era and the manufacturing. Next up is the Cold War, from 1947 to 1991. Next up is World War II, from 1939 to 1945. Similar to the First World War, this is going to get messy. World War II was the second global war, and it was a direct result from the previous war. It spanned 16 years from September 1st, 1939 to September 2nd, 1945. First up's the Panzer tank, or the PZ-1. This Panzer tank was notorious in the Second World War. It was a fast tank with a 7.92 millimeter mounted machine gun equipped with light armor, making it a fast but weak tank. This was a German tank created by multiple German companies, such as Heinkel, MAN, Krupp, and Daimler. This image displays a German battlefield using the Panzer I in 1942. Germany primarily used this tank in the battle against France at the start of World War II, and it was viewed as outdated but resource efficient by the soldiers throughout the war. This tank was used by Germany for 4 years, from 1940 to 1944, receiving various redesigns throughout the war. On the right, you can see an image the US Army photographed of the Panzer tanks. Gotta admit, that photographer was quite brave. Next up is the first atomic bomb. The atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was the first ever nuclear warhead used in war, and it's had destructive capabilities beyond comprehension. J. Robert Oppenheimer is known as the father of the atomic bomb, and for good reason. He was the lead in something called the Manhattan Project. This was a project top secret by the United States government, and it was made for the war which was raging on. This bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, and was the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. It decimated the surrounding area, and the bomb landed on August 16, 1945 at exactly 8:15 a.m. The Japanese viewed this as a soul-crushing attack, which the strong-willed Japanese military acknowledged. It was soul-crushing for them, and this demonstration by the US led to their surrender. It was truly tragic what happened to all those lives in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Lastly, we have the Luger pistol, which was synonymous with Germany. This famous German pistol is often seen in pop culture thanks to its synonymy with Germany. This artifact is a one-to-one model created as historical evidence of the famous German pistol. The gun was used in 1908 until 1943 thanks to its small design. Allied soldiers were easily able to recognize a Nazi soldier by this gun, since nearly all Nazi soldiers were equipped with one. It was later replaced by its improved design, the Walther P38, which retained a similar design but greater quality. The German military saw this as a red flag in their military, as these pistols were easily producible and the soldiers were trained to use them, but it was difficult to switch to a newer design. On the right, you can see the replica, which is a one-to-one of the German Luger pistol. It was quite different compared to most of the Allies because of its neck. Next and lastly, we've got the Cold War from 1947 to 1991, lasting longer than any other topic on this list. The Cold War, where nothing happened. The Cold War was a conflict of ideals, tensions, spies, and much more. The Cold War lasted 44 years and spanned from March 21st, 1947 to December 26, 1991. The Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was the perfect way to visualize the Iron Curtain, which is a barrier the Soviet Russia set up to separate East and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall separated the capitalist western side of Berlin and the communist eastern side of Berlin. It separated the Soviet Union from Great Britain, France, and most notably, the United States. The wall was built on August 13, 1961, later being destroyed on November 9, 1989. It stood tall for 28 years, separating the German people in Berlin from one another. The German Wall symbolized the Cold War and in turn symbolizing the clashing of two ideologies, capitalism and communism. The Soviet military was busy preparing themselves for a war that could break out at any moment with the United States. This wall was an act to stop both Russian and German people from defecting to a capitalist rule. And on the right, you can see a fragment of the destroyed Berlin Wall nowadays. Next up, we have the Internet. The Internet is a global computer network that is based on a variety of information and communication facilities. The Internet is an easily accessible source of information and connection. Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf are the co-founders of TCP/IP protocols. They are known as the fathers of the Internet, and for good reason. Their projects was funded by the United States military during the Cold War in order to have an edge over the Soviets. During the late 1960s, the first prototype of the Internet was created, but it was not until January 1st, 1983 that the Internet was born. The Internet was a huge stepping stone leading towards the society we live today. This artifact depicts the dawn of the internet and the people behind it. The people saw this for the milestone it was. While they did not know much about it at first in the 1960s, 20 to 30 years later it took the world by storm. The world and its knowledge the, was finally accessible to the people, and they saw this as both a threat and a good sign of things to come. On the right, you can see scientists developing the first prototypes of the internet. And did you know that the first computers were the size of small houses? I don't know where we'd be without the internet today. I'm using it for this presentation. Next is the first man on the moon. This artifact is an image of the first man to ever set foot on the moon, marking one of the biggest wins the United States had over the Soviets during the Cold War. The Apollo 11 rocket was launched at 9:32 a.m. EDT on July 16th, and later the first step on the moon was taken at 2:56 p.m. on July 20th. This steps was taken by Neil Armstrong and was the mark that the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was over, with the United States taking the victory. Mankind was considered to be underprepared for this step into the unknown, but fueled by pride and the rising competition in the communist side of the world, this step onto the moon fueled the pride of the American people greatly, as they took part in one of the most major events in history. They are proud of their country. On the right, you can see Neil Armstrong taking one of the first steps ever on the moon and placing the United States flag there. Lastly, if you'll stick with us, we have a few statements from both our owner and Frederick G. Banting. First up is our owner's opinion on nuclear warfare. The owner's opinion on nuclear warheads. I believe that countries should have nuclear weapons because of the fear nuclear warfare poses to the world. When the Little Boy and Fat Man bombs dropped, there were long-lasting damages placed on Japan, effects that are still felt today. Nuclear weapons now are used as a deterrent to war, and everyone can agree that if anyone were to enter into a nuclear war, the world would end. There are approximately 12,800 nukes worldwide currently, and to that weaponry, countries refuse to enter into war. In the current atmosphere where Russia is making aggressive moves, they choose to attack a country that cannot retaliate through nuclear weaponry. Russia also refused to declare war on any countries armed with nuclear warheads because of what would likely follow suit. If Russia were to engage in a war with the United States of America, it would likely lead to nuclear warfare. That war The world would fall into chaos as there would be nothing to win from such a war such as that. Nuclear warheads act as a deterrent from conflict, as countries understand what nuclear warfare leads to. As long as a country is equipped with nuclear weapons, others will have to be cautious. Nuclear weaponry is what has kept countries from waging war for over a decade now. For example, the Cold War emerged due to ideological conflicts, the emergence of nuclear weapons, and the aftermath of World War II. The Cold War could have escalated into a worldwide battle, but it was unable to due to the threat of nuclear weapons. Both Russia and the United States refused to attack one another because of what nuclear warfare meant. Nuclear warfare and weapons are essential because of the threat they pose, and they are one of the main reasons war has not broken out since the conception of nuclear warheads. At least that's what I, the owner of this Canadian museum, believe. Next up is the best Canadian, and this opinion is by Frederick G. Banting, so this may be a tad bit biased. My name is Frederick G. Banting, and I'm the one who discovered insulin. My rise to fame started in 1921, shortly after the end of World War I. I ended up devoting my life's work to my research, and I finally had discovered it, insulin. But I had an entire life before I dedicated myself to my medical research, and I'm here to tell you about that. I was born on 1914, 1881, in Ontario, Canada, and later died in 1941. I'm the youngest kid out of five brothers, so you know damn well I got picked on. I later went on to study divinity at the University of Toronto, but I later transferred to the study of medicine because of how boring divinity got. In 1916, I graduated and joined the Canadian Army Medical Corps. I took part in World War I and served in France. Then in 1918, I got wounded by a stray bullet at the Battle of Cambrai, and a year later I was awarded with the Military Cross of Heroism under fire. In fact, I still have it today. To be honest, it's one of my proudest achievements, other than the whole insulin thing I'm famous for. After the war in 1919, I returned to Canada and was a medical practitioner in London, Ontario for a little while. During that time, I began studying diabetes and the effects it had on people. You see, there's two major types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. The general symptoms of both of these types are weight loss, blurred vision, feeling tired, dry skin, thirst, hunger, and more. You're also susceptible to more infections and diseases. Anyone at any age can get diabetes, although type 2 is far more common than type 1. Of those who have diabetes, only 5 to 10% of people have type 1, while the other 90 to 95 have type 2. Until my invention, people were forced to live with fatigue, hunger, anxiety, irritability issues, and much more, which they dealt with for their entire lives. In 1921, at the University of Toronto, I discovered it, insulin. It was revolutionary from the moment I invented it, and it was created by inserting a special gene into bacteria or yeast. This causes them to act like mini biofactories, producing proteins. We extracted these proteins and used them to synthesize insulin. It wasn't until a year later that we had our first test on our newly discovered insulin, and we tested it on a severely diabetic 14-year-old boy. The experiment fell short, and we didn't deliver the results we had expected. The 14-year-old boy sadly died later. Then, a year later, we synthesized a treatment for diabetes, something that would actually work, unlike its previous iteration. In 1923, I became the youngest person to ever receive a Nobel Prize. I was 32 years old at the time. By the end of 1923, the insulin I had discovered was available for commercial production, and the people could finally treat their diabetes. Patients around the world received insulin shots after and recovered from comas. This treatment would allow them to resume a normal life, and they could start eating whatever they wanted rather than being forced to pick what their bodies can handle. My discovery of insulin had given people a new lease on life, and still by far I consider it to be my crowning achievement. Thank you for that, Frederick G. Banting. Now we've got another statement from our museum owner about the Holocaust. He picked out two quotes to make a statement on, and this is what he thinks about the Holocaust education. First, the quote: "Indifference is the greatest sin and punishment for the Holocaust," by Eli Wiesel. The message of this quote is to acknowledge the dead and don't allow their deaths to be in vain. People often try to forget or ignore the bad things that have happened, but that only leads to them happening again. Millions of Jewish people died due to the Holocaust, and simply ignoring them and moving on from the horrors they experienced is a disrespect to them. Eli Wiesel is saying that the worst thing a person can do is ignore the Holocaust and the effects it had. To be indifferent about the atrocities committed in World War II means to ignore those who are suffering, invalidate their existence, and tell them that they are meaningless. Indifference is a punishment that lasts longer than a lifetime, as it allows the crimes of the past to be forgotten. Eli Wiesel tells us not to overlook the past and to forget about the people who have suffered. Instead, pa- we are meant to pass along its message so we do not make their deaths meaningless. The next quote is by Albert Einstein. "The world is too dangerous a place to live in, not because of the people who do evil, but because of the people who stand by and let them." This quote is telling us that very few actually act with malevolent intentions, but many are willing to stand idly by, refusing to challenge the opposition. Albert Einstein criticizes all those who passively stand and allow evil to occur without doing anything about it. Albert Einstein was alive from 1879 to 1955, meaning he lived through both world wars. Through those experiences, he gained an understanding of how individuals act and how people react. For example, Nazi Germany. While Hitler was put into power, because of his actions, many saw him as an evil dictator with too much power. These people chose to idly stand by and let him act upon his malicious ideals. Einstein says that those people who stand by idly choosing to turn a blind eye to Hitler's actions are truly in the wrong. The indifference that the people display is what makes the world a dangerous place. Einstein is telling us that if corrupt people are not allowed to act without consequences or scrutinization by the people, then the people are indirectly responsible for those evil actions. Thanks for listening to those few statements. That's all we have for you on this COVID tour. And if you'd like to see more, please call back and come by soon to the Canadian Museum of History. That's all for now.